Okay, we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll pick up in verse 6 and just a short kind of catch-up of where we are. I think it's important for us to remember the larger portion of where we are in the book because it does pertain to the topic under discussion in our text. You recall that we are in the second part, major part of the book, which began in chapter 7, where Paul begins answering a series of questions that they had. And he divides them up in a way in which you see this twice in chapter 7, now concerning. He begins that way, he has it in the middle of that chapter, and then you come to chapter 8, and he changes the subject again, now concerning things that are offered to idols. I bring that up because I want to remind you that we have not seen any change from that topic. And he's going to be coming up later on in chapter 12. You have something else. But that's kind of shows you a general context for everything he's saying. So in chapter 8, he specifically went through and looked at things that are offered to idols as a matter of recognizing that if you were going to eat those things, that were in not any kind of religious right sense, but simply you went and bought it and went from it, that should not be a divisive thing because there's nothing to that and that makes it special. But then in chapter 9, he then expanded upon that to talk about things with him of how criticisms about his choice, because at the end, remember chapter 8, he emphasized why he would make sacrifices that were not required morally, but that were helpful for the benefit of teaching people. And that was transition, took us into chapter 9, where he addressed these various ways in which he was willing to make personal sacrifices of not doing things he had every right to do otherwise, but it was because he prioritized others and their souls that he did not. So at the close of that chapter, in chapter 9, he then talks about how he had to make sure that in everything he was doing, that he was prioritizing them, but he had to take care of himself and his own decision-making to make sure that he did not fall into a trap of putting this effort into everyone else. He said, I have to make sure that I'm putting effort into myself, lest he says, I'd be disqualified, that I would all of a sudden fall into doing things I shouldn't. That was the statement that was made that led into now to chapter 10. That is important because as he opens in chapter 10, he says, moreover, brother, I do not want you to be unaware. So there are also some things, if you put these things together, he started this whole idea that was somewhat with idolatry in chapter 8. He involved himself in other ways through chapter 9. And now he comes down in chapter 10 and says, I need to make you aware, so I want to remind you of something, make sure something is on your mind. And then what we looked at in verses 1 through 5 were kind of an early days look at Israel, beginning when they became God's people at the crossing of the Red Sea, in which he then said typified baptism, following the cloud, and provided food, and this is actually important for what's coming up. They were provided food, they were provided water, and they were provided food in two different ways. You had both the idea of manna and quail, and they were provided water from a rock on two different occasions as well. You had two early occasions when they were provided both food and water, and then later on, they want more. They want something else that he provides. That's important backdrop because as he closed down in verse 5 in that first opening, he said, but with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So if you look at that, what he has just done is, here's everything that God had done for Israel. He did everything to make them his people. He did everything to provide for them as his people. And yet, because of their own behavior, they ended up not pleasing him. And so as a result of that, there were consequences. We know, going back, that where bodies were scattered in the wilderness, that's a specific reference to Numbers 14, because they refused to go into the land because of the report of the 10 spies. And they refused that, and as a result then of what began in chapter 12, then you're not going to go in the land. You don't want to go in the land? You're not going into the land. You're all going to die without going into the land. That's the consequence. Okay. So with that in mind then, we pick up in verse 6, in which now he's essentially going to go into greater detail. Okay. Verse 5 was an overview of a statement of the fact that they all died. Now, that's generally speaking. What he's going to do in the verses here that follow is he's going to bring up specific instances in which there were larger consequences, bigger instances that illustrate the problem of where they were spiritually and throughout all of this. So he's going to start early and it's going to extend late. So it's an overview, but each one is going to highlight something that is important, and it's going to all be associated in some way with the problem that he has addressed at this opening. So let's read verse 6, and then we'll get that going. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Okay, so the first thing that should be of interest to us is there's a really important but side note to this, that these things became our examples. So he's looking back at what was just said, and the question is he looking back to everything 1 through 5, or is he actually being very specific about the instances of scattered in the wilderness? Since the end part, the purpose of it is that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted, it would indicate he's actually just pointing to what he just said of the consequences they suffered because, and the reason why is stated here, because of what they wanted the wrong things. Okay? They were too focused on wanting the wrong things, and because they wanted the wrong things, that's where these problems came from. So they were examples. Now here, let's consider just a side note quickly what that means. If these things were their examples, now most of the congregation in Corinth, it would appear that most of them were Gentiles, right? There were Jews there for sure too, but most were Gentiles. He's giving them an example, and he's putting them firmly, backing them up to the Jewish context of early Israel. But he says, now these Israelites doing what they did, and I'm going to go into detail here in a moment, they became examples, our examples. That implies then that for people wholly unconnected, never under the old covenant, that there was value, and it was intentional that they be familiar with and learn from what happened to the Israelites, correct? Okay, what does that say then? Somebody's got to be with me here on this. There is value in studying the Old Testament, and we are wrong if we do not. Because you're going to miss how many examples exist. Now, the nature of the examples, he's showing us in this text how to then take something that was for them, but yet you are not yourself under, and how to make application from that. So not only is he saying it's valuable, he is demonstrating to us how to use the Old Testament within this passage. Okay? So the first thing is the Old Testament has value for us today, and there are a lot of people that forget that or deny that even. Okay? It has particular value. We're not under it. Okay? It has, the emphasis is on, you'll notice, For the examples. That's what he's citing. The value of the Old Testament for us is for the examples that it offers. And they're spiritual examples. Most of them negative, but some positive. Okay? He's going to bring up a lot of the negative. That's the first thing. But then he characterizes it. He's showing us, here's how we understand it. And that is, here are examples. It's a type. Okay? Here is something that happened before so that you can kind of see ahead of what is a problem. To the intent, it's just a phrase there, unto this end, that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. The word lust just means desire, and so that's why I say it's about what we want. Okay? And the problem is wanting the wrong things. And so he's going to go into greater detail, and when we go through, you're looking at what were they wanting out of this? They were captured by something. They wanted something they did not have a right to. They shouldn't have wanted. They were drawn off sides by it, if you will. And there's our problem. So what he has just done is he's extracted a principle from the whole that is recognized in the new covenant. And so the connection point between the example from the Old Testament and how it applies to the people in the New is connected by the principle that crosses both. Okay, I can't tell the difference right now, whether or not y'all don't understand a word I just said, or you're thinking, well, everybody knows that, Kevin, move on. Like, it's really tough to tell. Y'all are kind of stoic. So let's look at the examples beginning in verse 7. And these, I just want us to make sure we understand how it builds on verses 1 through 5, how it is characterizing why they fell in the wilderness, generally from the end of verse 5. The problem was because they wanted the wrong things, and so now he's giving the examples. And do not become idolaters as were some of them. All right, there's a reason why he brings this up first, isn't there? Why did I bring up all that general context of where we are? Idolatry. And you're going to see this as a theme. So now, as we start developing this, of these examples he's going to be giving, why does he need to bring up idolatry? And he's saying, you don't become idolaters. Well, what were some of them? They had been idolaters. So he's saying, you don't become idolaters, as were some of them. So what does he do? He says, let me give you an example. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Direct quotation from Exodus, from a specific place in Exodus, chapter 32. Now, if we turn over to Exodus 32, for those that do not remember what that is about, you will remember the incident. This is the situation regarding the golden calf. Okay? This was considered the huge embarrassment, the stain on their whole. No one in Israel, 1,500 years later, wanted to bring this up. Guess what Paul does? He makes it first on the list. Okay? Because as he goes through and talks about what's going on, Moses is up with God on Sinai. Joshua's halfway up, and this is where Aaron is somewhat left in charge. There was a mistake. And he's got all this going on. We said, okay, they're pressuring. He's been gone all this time. What do they want? They want something to do. Now, I always want you to stop for a second here and realize what just happened. What was the core point then that led the beginning thing that touched off this whole series that ends up with a golden calf jumping out of the fire? Okay, it didn't actually happen. Okay, separation anxiety. Yes, it was. They were bored. Where's Moses? Where's Moses? I don't know what happened to Moses. It was, we've got to do something. That's right, we've got to do something. Okay, all of this, but I want you to think about the reason why that led up to this. We left at the way in which it turns out. Now, we say, that's one of the most ridiculous things you've ever heard, of a gold calf jumping out of the fire, and this is what happened. But now, let's at least be fair. These people had witnessed water turning into blood from the Nile, day turning into night. They had seen all sorts of pestilence come through, things dying, whole nation dying, and they had walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. They have received food provided for them miraculously out of nowhere, seemingly nowhere, and water from a rock. That all happened before they get to Sinai. So maybe it's not quite as big a leap, if you will, for a calf to jump. That was a pun no one caught. To jump out of the fire. Okay, now, when you look at what's going on with what he's doing, this is the commentary on it about what they'd be guilty of. The important word, though, they sat down to eat and drink. Pay attention to that wording. That's going to come back shortly in our chapter. But the last part is they ate and drank and rose up to play. There are three things that happened. Number one, eating and drinking this is a type of banquet that you have before an idol. What is our general context? Chapter 8? Things that are offered to an idol. Now he brings it back up that they are having this feast before the golden calf. So they have the feast. What do you do after you have the feast before the golden calf? They rose up to play. What does that mean? It's a very generic word. And some of you can kind of insert a lot of different things into it. The idea, though, that I give you at its core is they did something for their own amusement. That's how generic the word is. But within this context, when you put it next to the eat and drink and the association with the idol, when that is a verse chosen because of its tie to becoming idolaters, then most likely what we have here with the idea of play is you're rising up in some way to do something that is honoring to that calf. From the overall context and the condemnation that is coming directly from it. What was it they wanted? Remember what we found in verse 6? In this instance, what did they want? They wanted Moses back. It's interesting to me that on this occasion, and if you recall with Saul later on, he didn't have the patience to wait on Samuel to offer a sacrifice. Of the impatience to simply do the right thing, and we decide we need to do something. You covered already. But that was part of it. So there's a boredom. There's the idea of if they're not there, if Moses isn't there with me, then I'll just do whatever the next guy says. And we have that problem, if you think of it in terms of God's word, is that, okay, I don't have a direct answer what I want from what God says, but I can turn and find another answer from the next guy to get something I want. That's the problem. What do they end up doing? They get something that they want. It's the very thing that they're used to. Where did they get this idea of what you are to do? Number one, a calf. and that this is how you go about honoring a calf, which they called Jehovah, remember. That was one of the problems. They got it from Egypt. So you have all these kind of things you're just throwing in, and you're wanting what other people have because you're bored to do it God's way. You get bored with the right way. Okay, that's the first thing. So here is the direct instance. Again, this was such a huge deal. No one wanted this mentioned in Israel for their history. But then you come up, verse 8. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. 23,000. What was this instance? Say that louder, please. Okay, Numbers 25. What happens in Numbers 25? 24,000. I thought he said 23,000. That is correct. Thanks for bringing up a problem for me, Paco. That is correct. Hey, which is not really a problem if you realize that we're dealing with round numbers. Oh, good. What's your answer? Okay, well, I'll hear your answer. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. That's most likely. Look, you've got multiple possibilities. I think that's a good one, and then maybe some like you had additional that ended up with 24. He's being more specific that it was on one day. You have the possibility that okay, it was 23,500. Okay, Paul likes to round down. Moses likes to round up. That's really not a problem here to recognize what he's doing. What we need to do, though, is in the instance, which is in Numbers, the situation is, this is we remember how it ends with Phinehas. Driving a javelin through a man and a woman. Do you remember why, though, he followed them into the tent, thrust them both through? Okay, what was the problem with the woman? Okay, so she is a Moabite that didn't have any right to. There's more to it even than that, though. When you get to chapter 25, here's how it opens. Now Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. All right, now we've got this instance. Now, the reminder of this that's important too, what was a big issue that we covered in chapters 5 and 6 of this book? Sexual immorality. Okay? They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. What you have happening is the women became the lure into the false religion. So now this is wanting a different thing. This was wanting a different thing. So the idea of sexual desire was still strong enough to where, okay, you come with me, and we're going to go over here and we're going to worship my God. So that's what was going on. Okay? So there is a tie here when he says that they are committing, number one, sexual immorality, and that is the judgment on them. Interestingly, if you go back, we combine this is due to the actions of Balaam. Remember that Balaam was going to tried to be paid off, and God wouldn't let him. He wanted to take the money and give the prophecy, but he knew God's in control of that. He wanted the money, but he ended up prophesying what God wanted him to say. Right after this, you find this. Later on, we find that it's Balaam's influence that he set up a situation to bring about Israel's downfall to get what they wanted in a different kind of way. What was it? To let them fall into a trap. It was a spiritual trap. Okay? And this same principle, okay, is letting, because you're not having your own self-control, okay, they didn't have the patience, they didn't have the connection with the leadership in the first one. Now, they're letting their sexual desire determine their religion. Well, no, that happens today in a number of different ways. Could be that what somebody tells you is okay, that's going to be the key. It is what determines sometimes, if you think about what people will accept in marriage, in multiple ways. Okay? It can be such a thing that the idea of the lure of just that other person is enough to make you decide, well, I'll go with them to church. The problem is that shouldn't be the basis for any of those decisions. Okay? But it's something that you want from this world that then becomes a lure to get you into a problem spiritually. Verse 9. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Where do we find this? Numbers 21, verse 4. Then they journeyed from Mount Horeb by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Okay, now they're then going to correct. They're going to say, wait. After the death comes, we want an answer for this, and that's when you get the bronze serpent. Everyone has to look at it, which Jesus refers to in John 3, or technically John refers to in John 3. I don't think that's it. I don't care about your red letters. I don't think that was Jesus speaking. So, what do you have here? It says, nor let us tempt Christ, as some also tempted. Did you notice that? They tempted Christ. Now he's making a connection here for the benefit of the Corinthians, but it's also true, and it's the same thing he did when you look back, and it has the connection with Christ being that rock. He's the one that they are saying isn't good enough. Now, that's why I wanted to go ahead and read. What was the problem they had? They were hungry and thirsty. Again. What had God done for them already? Was God perfectly capable of providing food for them and water for them? What did they say particularly about the food, the manna? Okay, so God's provided it. Now the problem is God's provided it, but we're sick of what God's provided. We want something different. So now it's about variety. Okay? So if you think about what it is what is the temptation? When it says they tempted Christ, what is the point there about what made it a temptation for him? There was a test. They put him to the test. As if he's not capable of taking care of all this? You brought us out here to die? That is, you have to understand, just think about this for a second, because I think it has a broader kind of benefit to think about it this way. You brought us out, you did all this, okay, all the 10 plagues, saved them through the Red Sea, all the provision for a long time, and their conclusion was that you brought us out to let us die. Does that make any sense at all? That's right, you ought to come to the opposite conclusion, that one who would go to such lengths to provide for you and get you where you are is perfect. Now, you know that he's perfectly capable of, but more than his just capability, it's a demonstration of the desire and will to care for you. You've seen evidence not just of the power he has, but of the care he has for you. You've seen evidence of both of those. And the test in some senses is, why should he bother doing all of this if this is the result? Is that you're testing him and treating him as if, I'm not sure you can do anything about our situation. Seriously? Tracy? Oh, she says that they didn't like the consequences, so they had to create their own crazy conspiracy theory. Not wrong. But you don't get what you want. So what is the tendency to do? What are they actually doing? Say that louder. Yeah, they are. Okay, it's a temper tantrum, and they're blaming God. Okay? Notice how often what we do is we get ourselves in a situation, it's a circumstance that we do not like, and despite the fact that God has given us plenty of evidence of his care, people will still come to a conclusion that God really doesn't love us because he's letting this happen to us. Okay? So it has to do with what I want getting in the way of the evidence already presented of who God is. And so that's what they have. Verse 10 kind of is a nice one to put at the end because it is basically all-inclusive, right? Now he's going to be more specific about this in verse 10. Nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, this probably is going to take us back to chapter 14, isn't it, of Numbers? You think it goes to 27? I think that's true too. So you start off, the original problem is that you are going to die in the wilderness. But then you come forward, and you also have multiple instances in which he is destroying them for their complaints. You have the original complaint. In chapter 16, you end up with the complaint of Korah, right? Now, if you go through all of this, what did you end up with when you get down and that they are just simply completely unhappy with anything that God has said? The destroyer is the language of the one that destroyed the firstborn of Egypt. Okay? So, if we're going to look through all that, they were complained, or grumbled. Okay, now, since we've got multiple instances we can use for this in their history. Going back to throwing a temper tantrum. You can kind of, if you just understand, I kind of like it in the way when it says they were the children of Israel, he really meant that literally. Because they behave like little children not getting their way a lot. Okay? So they throw the temper tantrum, they try to, they're not getting this, and he's trying to discipline them through the process. Okay? So they're complaining. Why are they, the idea of grumbling is probably stronger with this word, but the difference is, what's the difference, I guess I'll ask, between grumbling and complaining? Say it again. The constant nature of it, yes. A complaint tends to be made to the person against whom you have the problem, and grumbling is you talking to everybody but the person that can do something. That's kind of grumbling and complaining. So, complaint is when you go and talk to the elders and say, would someone tone down the crazy teacher? Bible class. That's a complaint, going directly to people who can do something about it. Grumbling is turning to your neighbor and saying, someone needs to do something about the crazy teacher in the Bible class. Okay, that's the difference between grumbling and complaining. But the whole idea here is that it was just this kind of whisper campaign about they're not getting what they want. And so now, what have we got? It's all tied to God wanting them to do things His way, and that's never good enough for them. That's never good enough. So you have these big incidents from their history, well known, of which you have, generally speaking, they get bored and they're impatient. They're driven by sexual desire, and then in the last, then they hungry and thirsty. These are core kind of things and wants, right? That God has a plan for and a place to take care of it. And then the other thing is where we want to talk. We just want to make a big deal out of it to only our friends. Sandra? That is exactly right. Is that the whole point of where we started of the desire, the lust, is what they wanted was the problem. They wanted something God did not, just said they shouldn't want. Okay? Or the nature of this is really even stronger, the fact that they wanted something, sexual desire itself, not wrong. Hunger, thirst, wanting something to drink, wanting something, not wrong. Okay? But placed contrary to God's will become wrong. Because you're wanting to place yourself in. At the core, each one of these, they thought they had a better plan than God did. That was the core problem across all of this. They were trying to substitute their plan regarding each one of these desires in for God's. And so, verse 11 says, now all these things happened to them as examples. So you see how it just tied these things together? When he began saying that they're examples, he said, all these things happened to them. They became to be examples. Now, the next part though. And they were written for our admonition. So they're examples themselves, but now he's added another layer to it. They were recorded in Scripture, inspired by the Holy Spirit, unto, actually I think this is toward, so it's the direction oriented. We're going to get to the unto in a minute. Here's where he was pointing. He wrote this down. It's history. You notice it doesn't help them when this is written down. It's just their history. So it doesn't actually serve as any kind of help to them at that point. It's written down looking toward us, to all the people in the future. But he specifically says, therefore, us. Upon whom the ends of the ages have come. First of all, who's the whom? If it's for our admonition, then doesn't that mean that the ends of the ages have come upon us? Specifically the Corinthians. Christians. Well, okay, that's right. This is when he says the ends of the ages, okay, of everything, the point he's making is is that this thing that happened long ago to the Israelites, he had always pointing toward as being examples for those who would fall into who become Christians, because this was the point all along, was to get us here. Now, judgment still is there, but with judgment being at the end, to get us to this point, the ends of the ages, in the sense of everything has been going on and going wrong to get us, we've finally to have arrived. And this, when did it arrive? First century. So he's going through and he's saying, okay, let's put all this together. Contextually, there's a concern that he has that he'll get into more next time. There's a reason why he's bringing up all these examples of the way people can behave when they let themselves and what they want get in the way, get in between them and God's will. In particular, he was dealing with idolatry problem. He did not want them then in this situation, and there's a little bit more we'll get into later on this, to take what he said in chapter 8 to indicate that to get to the point of where I can eat this and I'm fine because it's nothing, but you better be careful that that does not become entry point right back into your previous idolatry. Sexual immorality. Look, this is serious business, and if that's where you're going to have as your lead, it's going to take you into dangerous territory. When you put your physical needs above God's will, you end up in a bad spot. All of these things were written to show us as reminders how they behaved. What's the problem? They are men, we are men. In our interaction with God, they were tempted, we can be tempted. Don't make the same kind of mistake.